The Galactic Confederation's Capitol building was by all accounts a monument to bureaucratic excess. 17 different architectural styles from 14 different species had been mashed together in what the designers generously called cultural synthesis, and what everyone else recognized as a spectacular failure of committee decision-making. The result looked like someone had taken the galaxy's most prestigious buildings, thrown them into a blender, and reassembled the pieces while blindfolded. Inside this architectural abomination, the Committee for Mythological Species Classification was having what they considered a particularly productive morning, which, given their track record, meant they had successfully argued about the same 3 agenda items for only 4 hours instead of their usual 6. Ambassador Yethanara of the crystalline hegemony tapped her prismatic fingers against the obsidian conference table with the rhythmic precision of someone who had perfected the art of looking busy while accomplishing nothing. Her species had evolved from silicon-based organisms that prized efficiency above all else, which made her current career choice something of a cosmic joke. Item 47 on today's agenda, she announced to the assembled committee, budget allocation for the preservation of primitive folklore. Specifically, the continued cataloging of extinct species that never actually achieved spaceflight. She paused to let that sink in, though given the intellectual capacity of her colleagues, she could have paused for a geological era and still been rushing them. Councillor Blix9 from the Hive Collective buzzed his wings in what passed for agreement among his kind. His compound eyes, each the size of a dinner plate, reflected the chamber's artificial lighting in a way that made him look perpetually surprised. This was unfortunate, since Blix9 was rarely surprised by anything more complex than his own shadow. The Terran file remains our most extensive, Blix9 droned, consulting his holographic notes with the enthusiasm of someone reading a tax code. Also known as humans, Homo sapiens, or those bipedal things that supposedly made fire. Current status, completely mythical. Evidence of existence, approximately 0. Cultural impact on galactic development, laughably negligible. The committee shared what passed for chuckles among beings who had evolved humor separately and incompatibly. The Vex representative made a sound like grinding metal, while the aquatic delegate from Nereid Prime produced a series of bubbles that meant either amusement or digestive distress. Director Fin Tao, whose elongated cranium housed what he optimistically called a brain, leaned forward with the gravity of someone about to share a profound insight. This was usually everyone's cue to check their communication devices for more interesting content. The Terran mythology presents several fascinating inconsistencies, he began, apparently unaware that fascinating was doing more heavy lifting than a cargo hauler in that sentence. They allegedly possessed something called nuclear weapons, despite having no recorded contact with any civilization advanced enough to split atoms. They supposedly achieved spaceflight using chemical propulsion, which our physicists assure me is like trying to cross an ocean by spitting really hard. Ambassador Yethanara nodded sagely, as if this revelation was news to anyone who had attended these meetings for more than 5 minutes. Indeed, the biological specifications alone are absurd. Bipedal locomotion, external skeletal structure made of calcium, and most ridiculously, they allegedly required continuous oxygen intake to survive. What kind of evolutionary dead-end designs a species that dies if it stops breathing for a few minutes? The committee murmured their agreement, though several members privately wondered if their own species' requirements were particularly more sensible. The methane breathers from Titan 7 maintained a tactful silence on this particular topic. Furthermore, Fin Tao continued, warming to his subject like a star-going supernova, the cultural artifacts we've collected suggest they organized themselves into something called nations, and spent considerable energy fighting each other over resources they could have simply synthesized. They allegedly created art, music, and literature while simultaneously developing increasingly efficient methods of self-destruction. Blix9's wings buzzed faster, indicating either deep thought or an approaching molt. The psychological profiles are equally implausible. According to the folklore, humans possessed something called persistence hunting, where they would chase prey animals until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. No intelligent species would evolve such an inefficient hunting strategy when perfectly good disintegration rays are available. What the committee didn't know, as they sat in their climate-controlled chamber debating the impossibility of human existence, was that their conversation was being monitored, not by their own security systems, which were too busy scanning for known threats to notice unknown ones, but by a small, unremarkable probe that had been sitting in their ventilation system for the past 3 months. The probe's data stream was being transmitted to a ship currently positioned just outside their sensor range, a feat that would have been impossible if the Confederation's sensor technology was half as advanced as they claimed. The ship itself was a masterpiece of engineering that their best scientists would have dismissed as theoretical impossibility, constructed using principles they had yet to discover and powered by technology they couldn't even begin to comprehend. Inside this impossible vessel, its sole occupant listened to the committee's discussion with the patience of someone who had heard this particular brand of arrogance before. She made notes in a language that predated their oldest civilization, planned her approach with the precision of someone who had studied their weaknesses for decades, and checked her equipment with the casual competence of someone who could probably conquer their entire confederation before lunch if she felt particularly motivated. Outside the committee chamber, a minor security technician named Grix Delta noticed an anomaly in the morning sensor sweeps. A small blip, probably just space debris registering on the outer perimeter. He made a note to investigate it after his break, which was scheduled for another 2 hours. After all, nothing important ever happened during committee meetings. The technician's casual dismissal would in approximately 37 minutes prove to be the kind of bureaucratic oversight that historians would later describe as monumentally stupid, and the exact moment everything changed. But for now, the committee continued their productive morning of discussing the impossibility of a species that was, at that very moment, preparing to make their theoretical impossibility a very practical problem. The universe, it seemed, had quite the sense of humor. The first sign that the Confederation's morning was about to become significantly more interesting came in the form of Grix Delta's coffee mug exploding. Not literally exploding, mind you, though that would have been considerably less embarrassing than what actually happened. The mug simply slipped from his nerveless fingers as every sensor array in the Capitol's defense grid simultaneously had what could charitably be called a complete nervous breakdown. "Proximity alert," announced the station's artificial intelligence, with the calm tone of someone delivering weather updates. "Unknown vessel approaching, classification impossible. Threat assessment, please stand by while we recalibrate everything we know about physics." Grix Delta stared at his displays with the expression of someone watching their entire understanding of reality get fed through an industrial shredder. According to his instruments, something was approaching the Capitol. According to those same instruments, nothing was approaching the Cap. According to the quantum flux analyzers, whatever was or wasn't approaching had somehow achieved the impossible feat of existing and not existing simultaneously. The defense grid's automated responses kicked in with the sort of mechanical precision that the Confederation's engineers took tremendous pride in. Force fields activated, plasma batteries charged, and interdiction nets deployed with choreographed efficiency that would have been genuinely impressive if they had accomplished anything whatsoever. The approaching vessel, meanwhile, continued its leisurely approach with the casual indifference of someone strolling through a park. It didn't dodge the plasma bursts, because dodging implied the weapons were worth acknowledging. It didn't disable the force fields because the force fields apparently couldn't see it. It simply moved forward, leaving behind a trail of confused sensor readings, and what Grix Delta was beginning to suspect might be his career prospect. "Emergency protocols activated," the AI announced, still maintaining that insufferably calm tone. "Alerting senior staff to Category 7 spatial anomaly." Category 7 anomalies were the sort of thing that happened maybe once per galactic rotation, usually involving collapsed stars or dimensional rifts. They were not the sort of thing that docked politely at the visitor's platform and extended what appeared to be a boarding ramp. The vessel itself defied easy description, mainly because every time someone looked at it, their brain insisted they were seeing something slightly different. It was roughly the size of a small diplomatic transport, but its hull seemed to bend light in ways that made geometry professors weep. The propulsion system was completely invisible, which was problematic since their scanners insisted it had to have one somewhere. Grix Delta's supervisor, a massive Ursoid named Fenwick Prime, arrived at the security station with the sort of purposeful stride that usually preceded someone getting blamed for everything. His species had evolved from bear-like creatures that had learned to walk upright, use technology, and develop a sophisticated understanding of bureaucratic scapegoating. "Report," Fenwick Prime rumbled, though his tone suggested he was already preparing to be deeply disappointed in whatever he heard. "Sir, we have a confirmed docking of an unidentified vessel that doesn't exist," Grix Delta replied, wondering if there was any possible way to make that sentence sound less insane. "Elaborate," Fenwick Prime ordered, demonstrating the sort of optimism that kept middle management functioning throughout the galaxy. "The vessel appeared on our sensors approximately 8 minutes ago, though our temporal analysis suggests it may have been there for several hours, or possibly hasn't arrived yet. It bypassed our entire defense grid, not by disabling it, but by apparently convincing our systems that there was nothing to defend against. It's currently docked at Port 17, where it's simultaneously taking up space while also not being there." Fenwick Prime's expression suggested he was seriously reconsidering his career choices. "Have we attempted communication?" "Yes, sir. Our translation protocols can't identify the language, assuming it is a language and not just random electromagnetic noise that coincidentally resembles complex communication patterns. On the security monitors, they could see the boarding ramp had fully extended. A figure emerged from the vessel, and every camera that tried to focus on her immediately experienced what the technicians would later describe as interpretive difficulties. She was bipedal, which was common enough in the galaxy. She appeared to be wearing some sort of environmental suit, though it was unlike any design in their database. Most unnervingly, she moved with the sort of purposeful confidence that suggested she knew exactly where she was going, despite this being her first recorded visit to a station she theoretically shouldn't know exists. The figure approached the immigration checkpoint with unhurried steps, each footfall echoing through the security station's audio pickups with crystalline clarity. Behind her, the impossible vessel simply sat there, occupying space with what could only be described as smug satisfaction. "Sir," Grix Delta said, his voice climbing several octaves, "she's not showing up on the biological scanners." "Equipment malfunction," Fenwick Prime suggested hopefully. "No, sir. The scanners are working perfect. They're detecting her physical presence, her mass, her electromagnetic signature. They're just not detecting anything that matches any known species classification." Which meant, though neither of them wanted to voice it, that their visitor belonged to a species that existed outside their comprehensive galactic database. A database that supposedly contained every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. The woman reached the checkpoint and stood patiently, as if waiting for someone to remember their manners. When no one immediately appeared to greet her, she did something that would haunt the security recordings for decades to come. She laughed. It was a perfectly human sound, warm and genuine and completely impossible, according to everything the Galactic Confederation knew about the universe. The emergency session of the Committee for Mythological Species Classification convened with the sort of panicked efficiency usually reserved for imminent stellar collapse or budget audits. The irony that they were being summoned to deal with their primary area of supposed expertise was lost on absolutely no one, which made the situation significantly more uncomfortable for everyone involved. Ambassador Yeth Nara arrived first, her crystalline form practically vibrating with frequencies that translated roughly to "this is absolutely not my job description." She was followed by Blix 9, whose wing buzzing had reached a pitch that suggested either extreme agitation or an imminent molt. Director Fin Teo stumbled in last, his elongated cranium apparently weighing more than usual under the pressure of dealing with an actual crisis. The visitor had been escorted to conference room Alpha 7, which was the capital's most secure meeting space and also, coincidentally, the one with the most surveillance equipment. Security Chief Grand Vex, a hulking Titan-class being, whose species had evolved from particularly aggressive minerals, stood guard outside with the sort of confident posture that suggested he had no idea what he was guarding against. Inside the room, the impossible woman sat with perfect composure, her hands folded on the conference table as if she attended interdimensional diplomatic incidents every Tuesday. She had removed her helmet, revealing features that matched the mythological descriptions with terrifying accuracy: bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, and that distinctive mammalian hair that their xenobiologists had always insisted was an evolutionary impossibility. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice carried the sort of casual authority that made seasoned diplomats question their life choices. "And lady," she added with a nod to Yeth Nara, demonstrating an understanding of gender distinctions that their cultural database insisted humans couldn't possibly possess. Director Fin Teo cleared his throat with the sound of grinding gears. "According to our records, your species, well, fictional." The woman's smile contained enough diplomatic dynamite to level a small moon. "According to our records, Your confederation has been playing with toys and calling it advanced technology for about 3,000 years. Blix-9's wings stopped buzzing entirely, which in his species indicated either death or profound cognitive overload. Since he was still upright, the committee assumed the latter, though they weren't entirely certain. Impossible, Ambassador Yethnara managed, her prismatic form shifting through several colors that meant various combinations of disbelief, terror, and professional embarrassment. Our intelligence network spanned 12 galaxies. We would have detected any spacefaring civilization. Would you? The woman asked, and somehow managed to pack about 17 different kinds of condescension into 2 words. Your intelligence network's missed a species that's been watching you for the past 4 centuries. We've been observing your committee meetings, studying your technology, and occasionally fixing your more dangerous mistakes before they accidentally sterilized inhabited systems. The silence that followed was the sort of quiet that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete psychological breakdown. The committee appeared to be leaning toward the latter. That's, Finteo began, then stopped as his brain caught up with the implications. You've been watching, recording, occasionally laughing ourselves sick at your proceedings, she confirmed cheerfully. Did you know that your advanced quantum encryption can be cracked by what we call undergraduate mathematics? We've been reading your communications since you invented them. Yethnara's crystalline structure was now cycling through colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrum, indicating emotional states that their universal translators couldn't even begin to process. Our defenses are adorable, the woman interrupted, like watching children play with building blocks. Very determined children, but still children. Blix-9 finally managed to reactivate his wings long enough to produce a sound like static electricity. Your technology. The woman gestured to a small device on her wrist that looked roughly as advanced as their most sophisticated starship computers. This is what we call a basic communication array. It's about as sophisticated as your grandfather's watch, assuming your grandfather was particularly fond of obsolete technology. She touched the device, and suddenly the room's holographic displays came alive with information that made their best intelligence reports look like cave painting. Star charts showing human settlements throughout regions they had mapped as uninhabited wilderness. Resource extraction operations that dwarfed their largest industrial projects. Ship designs that treated their fastest vessels like quaint historical curiosity. We've been expanding outward for longer than your confederation has existed, she continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than casually demolishing everything they thought they knew about galactic civilization. We just happened to be expanding in directions you never thought to look. Director Finteo stared at the displays with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview get systematically deconstructed. The mathematics, the energy requirements. None of this should be possible, shouldn't it? The woman's tone carried just enough amusement to suggest she was enjoying this considerably more than her audience. Your physics models are based on incomplete data. You've been working with roughly 60% of the actual universal constant. It's like trying to understand music while being tone deaf. The room's environmental systems had begun making subtle adjustments. Recognizing that several committee members were showing signs of acute stress-induced biological dysfunction, the air recyclers worked overtime to process the various chemical emissions of panic, while the temperature controls struggled to accommodate beings whose internal thermostats were currently malfunctioning. But why? Yethnara asked, her voice fracturing into harmonic frequencies that suggested imminent crystalline breakdown. Why reveal yourselves now? The woman leaned back in her chair with the casual grace of someone who owned the room despite having no official right to be in. Because you're about to do something catastrophically stupid, and while we generally enjoy watching you fumble through galactic politics, this particular mistake would probably sterilize half the outer rim. She gestured to another display that showed what appeared to be construction projects in the neutral zone. Projects that, according to their classified files, absolutely did not exist, and definitely weren't being funded by a secret coalition of member species who thought they were being clever. Project Hegemony, she said simply, and watched with evident satisfaction as the committee members' various biological processes ground to a halt. Your attempt to build a pacification grid that would allow the Confederation to forcibly prevent conflicts by disabling any ships that show aggressive behavior. The fact that she knew about their most classified military project was problematic. The fact that she seemed to find it amusing was downright terrifying. The physics are sound, Finteo protested weakly, though his conviction was rapidly evaporating like atmosphere from a hull breach. The physics are functional, she corrected. The implementation is hilariously incompetent. Your pacification grid would create a cascading quantum resonance that would turn every star within 50 light-years into a supernova. Congratulations on inventing the galaxy's most elaborate suicide device. The woman stood up and suddenly the room felt considerably smaller despite its unchanged dimensions. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to cancel that project. Revise your understanding of galactic politics to include species that actually exist, and try very hard not to accidentally commit genocide while we decide whether this confederation is worth preserving. The committee stared at her with the unified expression of beings who had just discovered their entire civilization was built on foundations considerably less stable than they had assumed. The aftermath of revelation, it turned out, involved considerably more paperwork than anyone had anticipated. 3 hours later, the emergency session had evolved into what historians would eventually classify as the most significant diplomatic negotiation in galactic history, though at the time it resembled nothing so much as a group therapy session for beings experiencing acute existential crisis. Ambassador Yethnora had stopped changing colors entirely, settling into a dull gray that her species typically reserved for mourning or tax season. Director Finteo had developed a nervous tic that made his oversized cranium wobble like a badly balanced gyroscope. Blix9 hadn't spoken in 2 hours, though whether this was due to shock or simply because his translator had given up trying to process concepts that violated everything it knew about reality remained unclear. The human woman, meanwhile, had produced what she called preliminary documentation for establishing formal diplomatic relations. The documents themselves were written in 17 different languages, including several that the Confederation's linguistic experts swore didn't exist. The mathematical proofs alone were enough to keep their best theorists busy for the next decade, assuming their sanity survived the experience. The territorial adjustments are quite reasonable, she was saying, highlighting sections of the holographic display with casual gestures that somehow commanded the room's advanced projection system better than its actual operators. We're only asking for recognition of the territories we already occupy, plus a few minor adjustments to your shipping lanes to prevent accidental encounters with our patrol route. The minor adjustments involved rerouting roughly 40% of the Confederation's major trade corridors around regions they had always considered empty space. Space that, according to the new star charts, contained human installations that could probably vaporize their entire merchant fleet before breakfast. The technology sharing provisions are particularly generous, she continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that her audience was experiencing various forms of cognitive meltdown. We're prepared to provide limited access to certain technologies that might help you avoid accidentally exterminating yourself. Counselor Grex Omega from the Synthetic Collective, whose artificial consciousness had been rebooting continuously for the past hour, finally managed to process enough information to form a question. What do you want in return? The woman's smile could have powered a small space station. Entertainment value. The silence that followed was profound enough to make philosophers weep. Excuse me? Yethnora managed. You see, we've been watching your Confederation for quite some time, and you're absolutely fascinating. Not because you're particularly advanced, but because you've managed to create the galaxy's most elaborate bureaucracy while simultaneously remaining completely oblivious to the universe around you. It's like watching a civilization-sized comedy show. She gestured to the committee members with the fond indulgence of someone observing particularly clever pets. Take this committee, for instance. You've spent the last 3 years debating the mythological status of a species that was literally parked outside your front door. You've developed 17 different theories about why humans couldn't possibly exist while we were reading your email and occasionally fixing your environmental systems when they broke down. Blix-9's wings managed a single traumatized flutter. You fixed our environmental system. Atmospheric recycling plant 7 Alpha was about to poison your entire residential district last month. We sent a maintenance bot to prevent what would have been a rather embarrassing obituary for roughly 12 million beings. The revelation that their lives had been casually saved by the species they'd been dismissing as fictional was apparently the final straw for Director Finn Tao's remaining sanity. He made a sound like a deflating balloon and slumped forward onto the conference table. So, the woman continued, apparently untroubled by the ongoing psychological casualties, we're prepared to establish formal diplomatic relations, share selected technologies, and help you avoid accidentally sterilizing yourself, in exchange for continued observation rights and the occasional invitation to your more amusing bureaucratic disasters. She paused to let that settle in, though settling implied a level of mental stability that was currently in short supply. Oh, and we'll need you to update your mythological species files. Specifically, you can move humans from completely fictional to disappointingly real. We've prepared some basic documentation to help with the transition. A new holographic display materialized, showing what appeared to be a beginner's guide to human civilization, written in the sort of simple language typically reserved for explaining complex concepts to very young children. The committee stared at it with the expression of beings discovering that their doctoral dissertations had been written in crayon. Questions? The woman asked brightly. The committee members exchanged glances that communicated everything from "is this really happening?" to "should we just pretend this is all a very elaborate practical joke?" Ambassador Yethnora finally managed to formulate something resembling a diplomatic response. This will require significant adjustments to our understanding of galactic civilization. Oh, absolutely, the woman agreed. You'll need to revise your history books, update your star charts, recalibrate your threat assessments, and probably invest in some better sensor technology. We've included some recommendations in the appendices. She stood up, and once again the room seemed to reconfigure itself around her presence. I'll be returning to my ship now. You have 72 hours to present your formal response to our proposals. I suggest you use that time wisely. She moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something trivial. Oh, and you might want to recall that pacification grid project immediately. We'd rather not have to intervene directly, but we will if necessary. Trust me, you don't want to see what our intervention protocols look like. The threat was delivered with such casual pleasantness that it took several seconds for its implications to fully register. By the time the committee members realized they had just been politely informed that their entire military might was essentially decorative, the woman had already left the room. Grix Delta's voice crackled over the communication system, carrying news that somehow managed to be both completely predictable and utterly devastating. Sirs, the vessel has departed. Our sensors indicate it's no longer in the system, though they're not entirely certain it was ever here to begin with. The committee sat in stunned silence, contemplating a universe that had suddenly become much larger and significantly more complicated than they had imagined. Outside their windows, the capital's normal operations continued with blissful ignorance, while inside Conference Room Alpha 7, 5 beings grappled with the realization that everything they thought they knew about galactic civilization was about as accurate as a children's picture book. Director Finn Tao was the first to speak, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose entire professional identity had just been relocated to the nearest waste disposal unit. So, humans are apparently, Yethnora replied, her crystalline form now a color that didn't exist in any known spectrum, and probably indicated psychological states that transcended conventional understanding. And they've been watching us for centuries, and they think we're amusing. Blix-9's wings produced a sound like a dying communication array. We're the primitive species. The truth of that statement settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. They weren't the advanced galactic civilization they had always believed themselves to be. They were the folklore, the quaint primitives being observed and occasionally assisted by beings so far beyond their understanding that humanity had bothered to invent better technology just to avoid being detected by their sensors. The Galactic Confederation, it turned out, had been the galactic equivalent of a nature preserve, and they were the endangered species being protected from their own incompetence.
The universe, as it happened, had an absolutely wicked sense of humor,